Today, the intellectual virtues, we are talking about the excellence of just the intellect acting by itself. So here's where the intellect isn't telling the body what to do and acting in the world. This is just the mind acting on its own, as it does when you read or think or contemplate or learn. So thinking about excellence of intellect, thinking about intellectual virtue is really going to be thinking about the perfection of our rational nature. So let's compare the moral virtues and the intellectual virtues, because again, as two different standards of excellence, two different kinds of activity, you're going to see some major differences, and that might be a way to really help you think about what makes the intellectual virtues distinct, or what makes intellectual virtue distinct as a standard. If you were to think about how many moral virtues there are, now remember we said last time, it's not just the standard 7 heavenly virtues, it's things like exercise and eating well and sleeping well and practicing soccer, etc., etc., etc. And so if I were to have you list moral virtues, you could really be here all day, right? There's all the standard moral stuff, there's activities, there's eating and sleeping, and the list could just go on and on and on. By contrast, as Aristotle tells you in Book 6, Chapter 3, there are 5 intellectual virtues. There are only these 5 intellectual virtues. And so it's not an unlimited amount. It's these 5 that we'll be focusing on. Likewise, the aim of moral virtue is that place where doing what's good for you also feels good. So it's a standard of health, it's a standard of living up to your potential, it's a standard of acting out in the world. By contrast, the aim, the goal of intellectual virtues is the apprehension of truth. So we can think about the different ways in which the mind accesses truth or aims at truth or achieves truth, Aristotle says. And so this is where he comes up with this list of 5. He says there are 5 different ways that we get access to truth, that we can sort of possess truth by way of affirmation or denial, he says. Finally, the last major difference here is that, as we saw with moral virtue, that virtuous standard is that middle ground, right? That mean, neither too little nor too much. What it means to be courageous is not to be too courageous and not too little courageous, just courageous in the right amount. If the intellectual virtues are about achieving truth, however, Aristotle is going to try to show you that more is always better. More truth better than less truth. And so, for example, he's not going to say that it's possible for you to know too much. That would be nonsense, Aristotle says. Knowing more is always better than knowing less. Now you might say, well, no, I might know things that might make me unhappy, or I might get lost in them. No, Aristotle's going to say, what might look to you like too much knowledge is really just too little of probably some other virtue, prudence, for example. And so in this case, we're really going to shoot for as much as we can possibly get. And this is what's going to make intellectual virtue a lifelong pursuit. Moral virtues are a lifelong pursuit insofar as you can just keep perfecting your habits and keep being excellent. Intellectual virtues are a lifelong pursuit because you can always learn more, you can always be better than you were yesterday. So I'm going to go through here and talk about these 5 intellectual virtues one at a time. In each case, I think there are good reasons to choose some of the translations that your translator has, but I want to sort of walk you through some other ones just as a way to kind of try to explain what Aristotle really means. And I start with art, not only because it's the first Aristotle lists, but also because I think it's the most misleading. When you think about art, you probably think about painting or poetry or sculpture, things that A, are skills that you do out in the world, and B, just don't seem to have anything to do with intellectual virtue. Furthermore, this is misleading because, of course, art really was unknown to the ancient Greeks. Of course, they had painting and sculpture, but they didn't really think of those as fine arts. They just thought of them as crafts. And in fact, it's the word for craft that Aristotle has chosen here. Our word art comes from the Latin ars, which is actually a translation of the Greek techne. And techne is that Greek word that for the Greeks really meant any kind of craft, not just the fine arts. So shoemaking is a techne, building houses is a techne, sculpture is a techne, making spaghetti is a techne. Both ars and techne can be translated as skill. That Latin ars, our word that we get our word art from, really means skill, which is why if you think about the older sense of the word art, you get something like the martial arts, right? Karate is a martial art. That doesn't mean it's a form of self-expression, right? You're not being creative or expressive when you do karate. Karate is a set of skills that you learn. In the modern age, of course, art has become something sort of seemingly detached from skill. You know, my 4-year-old could do that, blah, blah, blah. This is, you know, even if we don't necessarily attach any specific skill set to art anymore, this is where the word comes from. And so techne itself as a craft, as a standard for craft, can be translated as skill. But the word I actually want to use, and it's because we actually get it from techne, is our word technique. So if you think about what a technique is, of course a technique is a skill, but it's not just a skill, it's a specific way of doing something. And you can acquire multiple techniques to do the same thing. Furthermore, I want to move away from the word skill because so many of your skills really have to be habitual, right? So if you think about the skill of playing the piano, you only develop that skill through practice. And if you're developing it through practice, then it's really more what Aristotle would call a moral virtue. As opposed to the technique, say if you're studying piano, what you're going to learn from your piano teacher, they can't practice for you, right? They can't give you the muscle memory or the skill, but they can teach you techniques for doing things. And those techniques will help you improve, will help you develop the right kinds of skills. And techniques can be taught because they are absolutely intellectual, right? A technique is a knowledge of how to do something. So instead of art, let's call this first intellectual virtue technique. As Aristotle says, a technique is a capacity to make. It's not the activity, right? That would be a skill and a practice and a moral virtue. It's the capacity to, it's knowing how to make. And so technique, this first intellectual virtue, is just going to be knowing true ways to make things. Now, what does it mean, a true way? This true course of reasoning for Aristotle simply means your technique really does lead you to the desired result, right? So if I have a technique for making lasagna, it's a good technique if it actually does produce a lasagna. If my technique keeps producing something that's not a lasagna, or it produces a lasagna that you can't eat, then it's what Aristotle calls a false course of reasoning. I've got a bad technique. So as a virtue, as an excellence, technique is going to be a way of accessing truth insofar as it's a true way of doing something. And again, Aristotle's going to say, the more techniques you have at your disposal, the better, right? It's never a bad thing to know another technique. It means you're really in a good position to choose the right one. So acquiring more techniques is going to be better, and you can keep pursuing techniques over the course of your whole life. This second, I think a bit clearer, scientific knowledge. I guess we just have to mention, of course, that modern science really doesn't exist before the early 17th century. For Aristotle, for example, science and philosophy and mathematics aren't distinct at all. They're all just sort of what he's lumping here under scientific knowledge. And scientific knowledge, our word science actually comes from the Latin scientia, which is the Latin translation of the word Aristotle uses, which is episteme. And scientia and episteme both just mean knowledge. And so, of course, it's a little redundant to say scientific knowledge. This just means knowledge-y knowledge, right? But I think the reason your translator chooses scientific knowledge is just to get you thinking about that kind of knowledge that can be sort of proven and demonstrated and rests on, say, facts and evidence. It's just, in Aristotle's sense, it's going to be a much broader category. If I know how to get from my house to Wheeling Jesuit University, that knowledge is scientific, not insofar as I had to sort of test it out in a laboratory, or, it's a kind of biology or chemistry, but rather just insofar as it's knowledge of reality, it's demonstrable, I can teach it to you, I'm teaching you true facts. And so knowledge in this sense, just sort of working through facts and evidence and demonstration. In that case, then, I'm just going to simplify this a little bit and just call this second one knowledge. Because if you talk about knowledge, I think for most of you, this really will capture what your translator has spelled out by scientific knowledge. Probably better than the translation. Now, as Aristotle tells you, this is, again, about knowing things, and he's going to talk about necessity, things that are not capable of being otherwise, but that's just to say, if something could be otherwise, if things can change, then I can't know what's going on when I'm away from them, right? So is there a cupcake in my fridge? Well, I believe there is, but only if my roommate hasn't eaten it yet, right? So I believe that, but I don't really know it unless I'm in front of it. On the other hand, Aristotle says the things that don't change, right? The kinds of facts that, say, we acquire through science, or, say, again, knowing how to get from my apartment to Wheeling Jesuit University. And insofar as that doesn't change, I can always be confident that I know it even when I'm away from it. Again, remember, more knowledge always better than less. You're never in a worse off position for knowing something you didn't know before. That's more information to work on. And again, we can just go through life acquiring more and more knowledge. Practical wisdom, I think, is a fairly straightforward translation. But again, I think we can do a little bit better. Practical wisdom, the word Aristotle uses, phronesis, you can also translate more simply as prudence. So again, what does it mean to talk about practical wisdom? What makes wisdom practical? Well, prudence, I think, cuts right to it, right? So if prudence is a kind of good judgment, that's really the virtue here, the intellectual virtue. And again, good judgment is going to be a way of accessing truth. Good judgment is knowing what's really good for you, as opposed to just what you think is good for you. So let's call phronesis, practical wisdom, prudence. And now we can see that this is exactly what Aristotle is talking about, right? It's thought to be the mark of someone with prudence to be able to deliberate well about what is good and expedient for himself. So again, what really is best for you? If you are prudent, if you have good judgment, you're going to be able to figure out what's really, truly good for you. As opposed to if you have bad judgment, again, you want to be happy, you're going to try to do something, but you don't know what's really good for you. You have a false idea about what's good for you. Notice then that prudence, this third intellectual virtue, is what connects the intellectual virtues with the moral virtues. How do you develop good habits? Remember from last time, you can't just follow what feels good, right? What feels good is simply what you're used to. Instead, you have to do what's good for you. To know what's really good for you, you have to have prudence. And again, having more prudence, being more prudent is always better than being less prudent. It's always better to know more fully what's good for you, what's really in your interest. It's just how you're going to make better decisions. Philosophic wisdom, this other kind of wisdom as your translator uses it, I think is much more what we typically mean by the word wisdom. And that for a good reason. Philosophic wisdom here comes from the Greek sophia, which of course is the second half of the word philosophy, right? Philosophia, philosophy has to do with wisdom, which is of course why your translator has spelled this out, philosophic wisdom. It's just Aristotle doesn't use two words here, he just uses the one, sophia. The other half of the word philosophy, philein, is to love. So the love of wisdom is philosophical, and so it would be a little redundant to say philosophical wisdom in Greek, right? It's the love of wisdom, or the wisdom of those who love wisdom. Now, really, the wisdom that those who love wisdom are pursuing, a little redundant. So let's just call philosophical wisdom straight up wisdom, since we've pulled the word wisdom out of the previous one and just called that one prudence. So when we talk about wisdom, we can then just talk about what your translator's calling philosophic wisdom. Now, what is philosophic wisdom? Aristotle is going to tell you it is these sort of, think about the things that we ask about in philosophy, right? These sort of very highest abstract truths. For Aristotle, knowing specific things is the mark of a good scientist, but knowing the very abstract, universal things, that's the mark of a philosopher. These very highest questions about why, the meaning of life. Look at what Aristotle's doing in this book. And at the end, he'll tell you, wisdom must be intuitive reason combined with scientific knowledge. But in this case, scientific knowledge of what he calls the highest objects. Now, by highest objects, he really just means the biggest questions, the most abstract truths. So again, the kinds of pursuits you get through philosophy, that's what Aristotle means by wisdom. This other half of it, though, if wisdom is intuitive reason plus scientific knowledge, you know scientific knowledge at this point, episteme, but what is this intuitive reason? This is, I will warn you, the weird one. You'll notice you don't really get a description of it in the selection that I've given you. Aristotle spends a lot more time talking about this in some of his other works. The word he's using is nous, which you can really translate a number of other ways. It actually rarely gets translated as intuitive reason. It's far more common to see this word translated as mind or intuition or intellect or comprehension. And to think about what it means to comprehend something here. In this case, we'll use the word intellect because it's the more common translation of the term. But if you think about intellect, you already notice this isn't exactly an activity, right? It's not exactly like knowing or showing good judgment or having technique. Intellect is this kind of abstract description of your state. So let's say that nous, or intellect here, is comprehension in this sense that it's something that happens to you. Right? You're struggling with a problem, you're trying to understand something, and it keeps going around in your head. You're thinking about it, you're thinking about it, you're thinking about it. It's not that at a certain point you choose to understand it. It's rather that understanding sort of happens to you at a certain point. Oh, I get it now, you'll say. It's that sort of dawning realization. That's the moment of nous for Aristotle. And so again, what happens as you live your life and gain experience and think, Aristotle says, is just that you gain more and more of this nous. And again, that's a good thing, right? More comprehension, really understanding first truths more is going to be better. And of course, from there, Aristotle thinks you'll build your scientific demonstrations, more scientific knowledge. Those two will work together to produce philosophic wisdom, etc., etc. So these then are the 5 intellectual virtues, the 5 ways our soul apprehends truth. And insofar as we are seeking truth and seeking more truth, these are the 5 ways we do it. These are the 5 things that we need to get more of. Again, what does this have to do with happiness? This is simply what it means to be more human. The more intellectual virtue you have, the more you really actualize and perfect your rational nature. This, for Aristotle, is the whole reason to be human instead of a cat or a hedgehog or something, right? If being human is our ability to reason and think and know and understand and look around us and seek wisdom in the world, then the more of this you do, the more human you're being, and you're really living up to your potential in that sense. So this is Aristotle's account of the intellectual virtues. If we add this to his account of the moral virtues, you really get this full sense of living up to your potential, of living a good, properly human life.
I don't